The morning Deborah Finch signed the remortgage papers on the house she had lived in for 23 years, she was smiling because she believed she was doing it for love. She sat at the kitchen table where she had marked examination papers, raised 2 children, and eaten 1,000 solitary breakfasts since her divorce. And she signed her name on a document that would eventually cost her everything she had spent a lifetime building. She signed it carefully, with the same deliberate penmanship she had used on every official document throughout 40 years of professional life. She signed it believing that the man she loved was real, that his gratitude was genuine, and that the sacrifice she was making was the kind that love occasionally required of people brave enough to offer it without conditions. She was wrong about all of it. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins much earlier, in the particular silence of a retirement she had not been prepared for, in the space between who Deborah Finch had been for 40 years and who she was still trying to become, and in the precise, calculated moment when someone on the other side of the world looked at that silence and saw an opportunity. Deborah Finch had run Castlegate Secondary School in Nottingham for 11 years. Before that, she had been deputy head for 8, head of English for 7 before that, and a classroom teacher for the decade before that. 40 years in education. 40 years of early mornings and impossible decisions, and parents who blamed her and students who occasionally, years later, wrote to thank her. 40 years of being the person in the room that other people looked to when they did not know what to do. She had been good at it. Genuinely, uncommonly good. The kind of leader who remembered the names of every student in the building and the names of their siblings, and in several cases, the names of their dogs. She ran at tight institution results, improved every year she was in charge. Exclusion rates dropped. Staff retention increased. But she ran it with a warmth that her colleagues said was rare in someone who also had such an absolute command of consequence. People did not fear Deborah Finch. They respected her, which is the harder thing to earn and the easier thing to lose. She took early retirement at 56. Not because she was pushed, she was not, but because she had looked at the years ahead and calculated, in the same methodical way she calculated everything, that she had enough pension, enough savings, and enough life left to do something other than administration. She had a list. She had always had lists. Travel, reading. The Marine Conservation Volunteering Program she had been putting off for 15 years. A pottery class she had signed up for and abandoned 3 times due to work commitments. She would finally, at 56, have time. What she had not calculated was the silence. It arrived on her first Monday of retirement, quietly and without drama, and it did not leave. The house, which had always felt full of the noise she brought home from work papers to mark, calls to return, plans to draft, revealed itself to be simply a house. 3 bedrooms, a garden that needed attention, rooms that echoed slightly because she had never bothered to fill them properly, always assuming she would get to it eventually. Her daughter Gloria lived in Edinburgh. Her son Patrick lived in Bristol. They called on Sundays sometimes, and on her birthday without fail, and they loved her in the particular way that adult children love a parent who has always seemed not to need very much, at a distance that felt appropriate, because she had spent so much of their lives appearing completely sufficient. She had never told them about the loneliness. She had not told anyone. For a woman who had built her career on being perceptive about what other people were experiencing and never saying so before the moment was right, the idea of naming her own interior life felt almost embarrassingly amateur. She joined a pottery class. She attended 4 sessions and found the instructor patronizing and the clay resistant, and herself more frustrated than soothed. She looked into the Marine Conservation Volunteering and discovered that the nearest program required significant travel and would not begin for 7 months. She read 11 novels in 6 weeks and found, at the end of each one, the same flat silence, waiting. It was her friend and former colleague, Marcus Webb, retired himself 2 years earlier, after 30 years as head of maths at a school across the city, who suggested the language exchange platform. He had joined it himself to keep his French from rusting completely and had found, he said, that it was simply good for the brain to talk to people from other places, not for friendship necessarily, just for engagement, just for the specific pleasure of conversation with someone who was not already familiar with everything you were going to say. Deborah created a profile on a Thursday evening in late autumn, approximately 18 months into her retirement. She listed her interests honestly: literature, educational policy, environmental conservation, marine ecosystems, the history of language. She uploaded a photograph she did not hate. She described herself as a retired educator, looking for intelligent correspondence and language exchange. She did not describe herself as lonely. She did not need to. The profile, read by someone trained to notice exactly this, said everything that needed to be said. His first message arrived on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after she joined the platform. It was not what she had expected. She had received several messages by then, brief, slightly formal introductions that had the flavor of template letters, easy to receive and just as easy to set aside. This one was different. It was long. It was specific. It referenced, directly and with apparent genuine interest, the marine ecosystem comment in her profile. And it asked her a question about coral reef degradation in the Indian Ocean that demonstrated at least a working knowledge of the subject. His name was Emmanuel Osei Boateng. He was 26 years old, based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and he explained, a second-year marine biology student at the University of Dar es Salaam. He wrote in English that was careful and occasionally formal in the way that suggests someone who had learned the language thoroughly rather than casually, which Deborah, who had spent years teaching English, found she appreciated. He was interested in practicing conversational English with a native speaker, he said. But more than that, he had read her profile and thought that they might have genuinely interesting things to discuss. She sat with the message for a while before replying. There was something in it that felt different from the other introductions she had received. A quality of attention, a specificity, a sense that whoever had written it had actually read what she had written and responded to it rather than simply responding to her. She wrote back. She answered his question about coral reefs and asked him one in return about the state of marine research funding in East Africa, a topic she knew almost nothing about and was genuinely curious to learn. He replied within 24 hours. The answer was detailed and personal. He talked about the challenges of studying marine biology in a country where the ocean was an economic resource first and a scientific subject second, about the tension between conservation and the livelihoods of fishing communities, about a particular stretch of coastline north of the city that he visited when he needed to think. He wrote about it with the specificity of someone who had actually been there. Deborah read the message twice. What followed, over the next several weeks, was simply correspondence. No declarations, no flattery. Long, thoughtful exchanges about books they had both read and books only one of them had, about the difference between the British education system and the Tanzanian one, about marine conservation, about the strange particular loneliness of being 26 and ambitious in a system that seemed designed to exhaust ambition before it could fully form. He was curious about her career and education in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. He asked questions that required her to think before answering, not softballs, not the kind of careful, deferential questions that people ask authority figures to avoid controversy. Real questions. Questions that assumed she had opinions worth challenging. For a woman who had spent 40 years in a room where she was always the most senior person present, being engaged as an equal was quietly exhilarating. She found herself looking forward to his messages. She found herself, for the first time in 18 months of retirement, thinking ahead, composing responses in her mind during her afternoon walks, noting things she wanted to share with him when she sat down at her laptop in the evenings. The silence that had been so persistent and so heavy began, almost imperceptibly, to lift. She did not identify this as the beginning of something dangerous. She identified it as exactly what Marcus had suggested it would be: intellectual engagement. Stimulation. Something to do with a mind that had, she was beginning to admit to herself, been growing restless in ways that pottery and novels had not been able to address. She was not falling in love. She was simply, after a long period of quiet, beginning to feel present again. That was all. That was enough. And that was exactly what made it work. By the third month of their correspondence, they had moved from the platform's internal messaging system to email, which Emmanuel had suggested on the grounds that the platform's interface made long messages difficult to format properly. Deborah had agreed without much thought. The emails were longer, richer, and more frequent. They were also, she would later realize, no longer on a monitored platform. It was around this time that Emmanuel began, gradually and without announcement, to share more of himself. Not the intellectual self that had been present from the beginning, but something softer. His mother was unwell, a chronic condition, nothing immediately life-threatening, but expensive to manage. His scholarship covered his university fees, but nothing beyond them. He worked part-time, he said, in a seafood processing plant near the port, hours that left him exhausted and made studying harder than it needed to be. He described these things without complaint, almost in passing, tucking them into longer messages about other things as if they were simply facts rather than difficulties worth dwelling on. He never asked for anything. That point cannot be overstated, because it was the point that Deborah would return to again and again in the months that followed, assembling her own understanding of what had happened to her. He never asked. He simply shared. And Deborah, who had spent 4 decades in a role where people brought their difficulties to her and she was expected to respond with practical steadiness, felt something in her chest that she did not have a name for at the time but would later identify, with the help of a therapist, as the activation of a very old reflex, the deep, almost physical satisfaction of being the person that someone specific needed. She had spent her career steadying other people's ships. It had been, she would eventually understand, the closest thing to feeling loved that she had consistently experienced as an adult. When Emmanuel shared his difficulties without asking for her help, she offered it, not financially, not yet, but with advice, with encouragement, with the particular quality of attention that she had always given to the people in her care. He received it with what felt like genuine gratitude. He told her, carefully, that her belief in him meant something he struggled to articulate. He told her that the people in his life had not always understood his ambitions. He told her that their correspondence had become something he looked forward to in a way that he hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to categorize. She told him she understood the feeling exactly. By the 5th month, he was writing every day. Not always long messages, sometimes just a paragraph, a photograph he had taken of the coastline, a question he had thought of during a lecture. But every day, the consistency of it had its own particular weight. She had been married for 16 years to a man who had, she now understood, been largely indifferent to her inner life for most of that time. She had raised 2 children who loved her and lived elsewhere. She had a close friend in Marcus and a handful of former colleagues she saw occasionally for dinner. She was not without connection. But she had not, and as long as she could honestly remember, been the daily, specific, voluntary focus of another person's attention. It felt, she told Dr. Marsh much later, like being remembered after a very long time of being slightly forgotten. The 6th month brought a shift that was small enough to seem natural and significant enough, in retrospect, to mark clearly as the moment the operation entered its 2nd phase. Emmanuel told her that he thought he might be developing feelings for her that went beyond friendship. He did not announce this. He circled it. He wrote that he had noticed, over the past several weeks, that her messages had become something more than correspondence to him, that he found himself thinking about her in the hours between messages, that he had spoken about her to no one because he was not sure there was language for what she had become to him, that he understood the distance and the difference in their ages, and that he was not saying any of this with any expectation attached, only because honesty felt more respectful than silence. Deborah read the message 3 times. Then she closed her laptop and went for a walk. She was 58 years old. He was 26. He was on the other side of the world. She was a retired headmistress, living alone in Nottingham with a remortgage she had not yet taken out and a silence she had not yet fully named. She was not the kind of woman who fell for young men from the internet. She had always been the kind of woman who identified that kind of thing clearly and spoke about it directly in the tone of someone who found such credulity faintly embarrassing. And yet, she returned to her laptop 2 hours later and wrote back. She told him that she had walked for 2 hours and thought about what he had said, and that the honest answer was that she did not know what to call what had developed between them either, but that she was not willing to dismiss it, simply because the category was unfamiliar to her. She had spent 40 years in a profession that required her to be careful and measured and appropriate. She was not certain that those qualities had served her as well in her personal life as they had in her professional one. Emmanuel responded the following morning. He said that her message had made him feel things that were difficult to put into words in a language that was not his first, and that he wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long time, to one day be in the same room as her. There it was, the first mention of meeting. The first installation of a future, not yet specific, not yet weighted with logistics, but present, a horizon to move toward. Deborah noticed that the silence in her house felt different that evening. Not lighter, exactly, but inhabited, occupied by something she could feel the shape of, even when she could not see it clearly. She was not naive. She was aware, in some intellectual compartment that she kept at a deliberate distance, that this was the kind of situation that people warned about. She had read articles. She had, years ago, sat in on a safeguarding training session that had included a brief segment on online fraud targeting older women. She had noted it the way you note information that is clearly relevant to other people's lives. What she could not do, and what no amount of professional intelligence could help her do, was apply that knowledge to herself while the thing was happening to her. Because the thing that was happening to her did not feel like the thing described in the articles. The thing described in the articles was clumsy and transparent. This was not clumsy. This was patient and specific, and it knew her in ways that clumsy things never could. The first financial request came in the 7th month. It arrived so carefully, so embedded in context, that it barely registered as a request at all. Emmanuel's mother had been prescribed a new course of medication. The cost, in Tanzanian shillings, translated to approximately 90 pounds. He mentioned it in passing, mid-message. The way someone mentions a difficulty, they have already decided to manage on their own, not as an appeal, but as an item in the ongoing account of his life that he shared with her, because she had become the person he shared his life with. He had already borrowed money from a colleague, he said. He would repay it by the end of the month. Deborah transferred 90 pounds before she finished reading the message. She told herself this was not about romance. She told herself this was what any compassionate person would do for a friend in need. She told herself that 90 pounds was nothing to her and a great deal to him, and that the mathematics of generosity were sometimes simply that straightforward. All of these things were at least partially true, which was what made them so effective as cover stories. Emmanuel's response was immediate and undone. He had not expected it, he said. He had not meant to imply he was embarrassed. He was grateful beyond what words could adequately carry. He would repay her. He said all of this at length, with the transparency of feeling that made the transaction feel like intimacy rather than transaction. He said that no one had ever done something like that for him without calculating what they might receive in return. She told him not to repay it. She told him it was a gift. He told her that he did not want her to think of him as someone who needed to be helped. She told him that she did not. She told him she thought of him as someone she cared about. The repayment, partial and unsolicited, arrived 3 weeks later. 60 pounds transferred with a message that he had worked an extra shift and wanted to return what he could. The partial repayment was, though she did not know it, a calibrated instrument, not an act of integrity, but a tool for making the next request feel safer. Because it proved that he was not simply taking and disappearing. It proved that he was someone who tried. It made her feel that her investment in him was justified rather than foolish. 6 weeks later, there was a fee for a research placement at a coastal station north of the city. 340 pounds. She paid it. A month after that, a laptop for his studies, the one he had been using, had failed. 475 pounds. She paid it. Each request came with context. Each came with reluctance. Each came with repayment, partial, effortful, accompanied by shame that made her reassure him rather than question the pattern. She was not thinking about the pattern. She was thinking about him, specifically and individually, which was the point. When you are thinking about a person, you are not thinking about a pattern. The pattern is what the person is hiding behind. The requests began to space out, which paradoxically made them easier to accommodate by the time the next one arrived. Enough time had passed that the previous one no longer felt recent. This spacing was not accidental. In records recovered much later, investigators found internal communications within the network that referred to this technique by a name that translated roughly as the cooling interval, the deliberate pause between extractions that prevents the target from registering accumulation. By the 9th month, they were speaking on the phone. His voice was warm and unhurried. with an accent that she found herself describing to Marcus, in a moment of candor that she would later regret and then reconsider and then be grateful for, as the most reassuring thing she had heard in years. There was something about the specificity of a voice, the way it could not be fabricated in the same way a message could. The way it occupied space differently that deepened what was already between them into something that felt immovably real. They discussed meeting. This had been gestured at since the 6th month, but now it became concrete. He would try to come to England. He was looking into visa requirements. He had a friend who had made the journey and knew the process. It would take time, but he was committed to it. Over the following months, 6 planned meetings accumulated and dissolved. Each cancellation came with a crisis that demanded immediate sympathy, a visa rejection with no clear route to appeal, his mother hospitalized without warning, a critical examination he could not defer, a financial complication with his university registration that threatened his entire degree. Each cancellation stripped away the immediate possibility of meeting and left behind in its place a deeper sense of his fragility, his need for her steadiness, her irreplaceability in his life. The crises were real enough in their emotional texture, though every detail within them was fabricated. She could not tell. She had no framework for telling. The only evidence she had was the quality of his distress, which was precise and consistent and completely believable. She bought flight tickets twice. Both times, he had a crisis that prevented travel in the weeks before departure. She absorbed the non-refundable costs without complaint. She absorbed them in the same spirit. She absorbed every other cost as evidence of her commitment, rather than evidence of a pattern she was refusing to see. The requests by the 12th month had escalated considerably in scale. A sudden emergency fee to prevent his university place being withdrawn. A medical cost for his mother that the local system could not cover. A legal fee related to a property dispute that threatened his family's housing. Each arrived in the context of what had by now become an established emotional reality. The ongoing life of a man she loved. A man whose world was held together largely by her willingness to help when it was needed. She remortgaged her house in the 14th month. She told herself it was a loan. She recorded it as such in a small notebook she kept in her kitchen drawer, sums given, dates, the vague reasons she had been offered. She believed, at the time she wrote the numbers down, that she was managing the situation with her customary precision. What she was actually doing was creating evidence for herself that the person who was doing this was someone who kept records and therefore someone who had not entirely lost her bearings. The notebook was a way of telling herself she was still in control of something. The total, by the 19th month, was £94,000. Gloria had not been told about a manual. This was not deception exactly. Deborah had simply categorized her personal life as her own to manage. A categorization she had maintained throughout her marriage and her divorce and every year that followed. Her children knew the broad contours of her life. They did not know its interior. But Gloria was sharp and had inherited her mother's perceptiveness in the way that children sometimes inherit the professional qualities of their parents without inheriting the blind spots. She had noticed over the past several months that her mother seemed distracted during their Sunday calls in a way that felt less like tiredness and more like occupation, as if part of her attention were elsewhere, devoted to something she was not ready to discuss. The remortgage document was not something Deborah had meant to share. It had been attached to an email that also contained other documents she was forwarding for a different purpose, and she had not noticed it was there until Gloria mentioned it in a phone call 2 days later, carefully, in the tone of someone who is trying to ask a question without sounding like they are asking a question. Gloria flew down from Edinburgh on a Friday morning. She did not warn her mother. She arrived at the house with a bag for 2 nights and let herself in with the key she still had, and found Deborah in the kitchen with her laptop, mid-message, wearing the expression that Gloria had seen on people who believe they are about to defend something important. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She had her mother's instinct for the question that could not be easily dismissed. She asked, "When are you planning to meet him?" The silence that followed had a quality that Gloria described later to D.C. Sandhu as the longest silence she had ever sat inside, longer than the silences after her parents' divorce, longer than the silences at the end of difficult phone calls. Her mother sat very still and said nothing, and it was the saying nothing that answered everything. They talked for 4 hours. Deborah defended Emmanuel with a thoroughness and precision that was itself a kind of evidence you do not argue that carefully for something that has not cost you something. Gloria listened. She did not challenge the details of Emmanuel's story. She asked only about the pattern, the meetings that had not happened, the money that had left the account, the question of what Deborah would say to one of her students if that student came to her with this story. The last question was the one that landed. Deborah called Marcus Webb that evening. He arrived within 40 minutes and stayed until past 2 in the morning. And he sat with her through the process of beginning to let the possibility that she had been lied to, that the connection she had built her last year and a half upon had been constructed by someone with a very different purpose than the one she had believed. He did not tell her she had been foolish. He did not suggest that she should have known. He told her, in the direct, uncomplicated way that defined his friendship, that he was sorry someone had done this to her. That phrasing "had done this to her" was the thing she kept returning to in the weeks that followed. She had done things. She had been the one who sent the money, who trusted, who chose to believe, who remortgaged the house. She had done all of it. And yet what Marcus was saying, and what she was slowly beginning to process, was that doing those things had not made her the author of what happened to her. Someone else had authored it. She had simply been present in their story without knowing she was there. She contacted D.C. Priya Sandhu on Monday morning. D.C. Sandhu was 38 years old and had been working in the Economic Crime Unit of Nottinghamshire Police for 6 years. She had been tracking the specific pattern of East African romance fraud operations for over a year by the time Deborah's report arrived on her desk, and she had developed the kind of weary, careful knowledge of the operational structure that comes from months of reading the same story with different names and different amounts attached. She met Deborah at the station on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 3 hours taking her statement. She later described Deborah as one of the most self-composed witnesses she had ever interviewed, not because she was not distressed, but because she had the discipline to separate what she knew from what she felt, to provide factual account before emotional account, to hand over the records she had kept, the notebook from the kitchen drawer, the email history, the bank statement she had printed, with the precision of someone who had spent a career valuing evidence. Sandhu recognized the operation immediately. The marine biology cover story, the language exchange platform, the slow build, the partial repayments, the canceled meetings. She had seen versions of all of it before. What was different about this case was the financial scale. £94,000 was the highest sum she had encountered in 18 months of working this specific pattern. It suggested a network that had invested significant time and resource in this particular target, which meant the target had been identified early as high value, and the operation had been run with unusual patience and care. The investigation began with IP tracing from the email correspondence Deborah provided. The addresses led initially to an internet cafe in Dar es Salaam, and subsequently, through cooperation with Tanzanian authorities, to a residential address shared by 4 individuals. Emmanuel Osei Boateng was located at that address within the first month of investigation. He was 26 years old. He did not resist. He sat quietly when authorities arrived, and said very little. Through a translator, once formal questioning began, he answered questions with a directness that Sandhu found unexpectedly unsettling. He had clearly expected to be found eventually. He did not claim that what he had done was not what it was. The communications recovered from the shared apartment were extensive. Internal network documents referred to Deborah as a target by code, not by name, but by a reference system that corresponded to her demographic profile and her stage in the extraction sequence. The figure she was expected to yield had been estimated at between £70,000 and £110,000 from the 3rd month of the operation. The actual figure of £94,000 was considered, in the recovered internal communications, a successful outcome. The handler referred to throughout as Solomon was identified through financial transaction records as a figure based with high probability in Nairobi. He had directed multiple operations across East Africa simultaneously, communicated exclusively through encrypted messaging, and moved between jurisdictions in patterns that suggested prior warning of law enforcement attention. By the time Tanzanian and British investigators had enough to move against him, he was gone. He was never apprehended. Emmanuel was prosecuted. The network connections added aggravating factors to the charges. He was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment by a Tanzanian court. The sentence was not long enough, in Sandhu's professional opinion, to constitute adequate consequence for what had been done. She said this to her supervisor. She did not say it to Deborah. The recovered funds were 6,200 pounds, less than 7% of the total. Deborah received this information in stages over a period of weeks, and the receiving of it was not a single experience, but a sequential one. Each new piece of confirmed fact replacing a piece of belief she had held, the way demolition works. Not explosively, but methodically, one structural element at a time, until what remains is a space that used to be something and is now simply open. She sold the house in the autumn following the investigation. The remortgage debt, combined with the money she had transferred directly, had made keeping the property untenable. She packed 23 years of accumulated life into boxes over 3 weeks and moved to a flat on the other side of the city that was clean and adequate and had nothing in it that remembered anything. She found this, strangely, the most difficult thing, not the financial loss, which she understood intellectually even when it made her stomach tighten, not the confirmation of what Emmanuel had done, which she had been preparing for since the Monday she called the police, but the particular grief of the house, the kitchen table, the garden, the room that had been Gloria's bedroom for the first 17 years of her life, then a study, then a spare room, then the place where Deborah kept her running shoes and her books about ocean conservation and the pottery she had made in those 4 sessions before she gave it up. That grief was not about Emmanuel. It predated Emmanuel and would outlast him. He had simply been the mechanism by which it had finally arrived. Gloria came, not asked, not invited. She simply arrived with her own boxes and spent 3 months in Nottingham, sleeping in the flat's second bedroom, eating dinner with her mother on weekdays and sometimes on weekends, doing the practical things that needed doing and leaving the emotional ones alone until her mother chose to pick them up. This was, Deborah later said, exactly the right approach and also something she never would have known to ask for, which was why it mattered so much that it was given without asking. Marcus came every Thursday evening. They watched nature documentaries. They drank tea and occasionally wine, and rarely talked about what had happened, which was not avoidance, but its opposite, a way of saying that what had happened was not the only thing in existence, that Thursday evenings were still Thursday evenings, that the world continued to contain things that were simply pleasant and uncomplicated and worth spending time inside. She began seeing Dr. Annette Marsh 8 months after the fraud was discovered. She went initially with the intention of resolving the situation efficiently, in the way she had always resolved difficult things by processing them thoroughly and moving forward with appropriate speed. Dr. Marsh, gently and without apparent effort, disrupted this intention within the first 2 sessions. The recovery she was guiding Deborah through was not a processing exercise. It was something slower and less linear and more honest than anything Deborah had submitted herself to before. The greatest obstacle, Dr. Marsh noted in records she would later summarize for a professional training document, was not grief for Emmanuel. Deborah's grief for Emmanuel was real, but it was also, she came to understand with time, grief for a fiction. It dissolved as the fiction dissolved, which was quickly and with a kind of relief that surprised her. The grief that did not dissolve was for the version of herself she had briefly believed was possible. The 58-year-old woman who had been chosen, who had been found interesting and worthy of daily, specific devotion, who had mattered to someone in a way that was entirely personal and had nothing to do with her professional competence or her institutional authority or her usefulness to other people's aims. That version of herself had been a lie that someone else had told her. But she had wanted so badly to believe it that the wanting itself had been real, and the wanting had not disappeared. When the lie was exposed, it simply had nowhere left to go. D.C. Sandhu's broader investigation, catalyzed by the evidence gathered in Deborah's case, identified 11 additional victims across the United Kingdom and Germany. 6 had never reported the fraud. 2 were, at the time of identification, still in active contact with network operators and did not yet know what was happening to them. Sandhu made those calls herself. She described them, years later, as among the hardest professional conversations she had ever had, not because the women were difficult, but because the news she was delivering was one that would require each of them to dismantle, immediately and without preparation, something they had spent months or years building, something that felt, from the inside, like the most important thing in their lives. The network continued to operate. Solomon was never found. New operators were recruited. New profiles were created. The platform on which Deborah had met Emmanuel updated its safety guidelines to include additional warnings about financial requests. The warnings were thorough and well-designed, and, in the opinion of everyone who worked in fraud prevention, not very effective, because the people being targeted were not people who had failed to read warnings. They were people who had found something real feeling inside the warning's blind spot. Sandhu presented a training seminar to regional fraud units 18 months after the investigation closed. She included, in the materials she distributed, a quote from a statement Deborah had provided to the National Crime Agency's fraud awareness campaign. She asked Deborah's permission first. Deborah gave it without hesitation. She said that if the statement did anything useful for anyone, then it should be used. The statement read, in part, I was not a foolish woman who believed a fairy tale. I was an intelligent woman who had been lonely for a very long time, and someone had studied that loneliness with great care and built something inside it. The architecture was theirs. The hunger was mine. Both things are true, and only one of them is something to be ashamed of. Sandhu used that quote in every fraud awareness session she ran for the following 3 years. She said it was the most accurate, single description of the mechanism she had ever encountered because it refused to make the victim either entirely helpless or entirely culpable, refused the easy narrative in either direction, and insisted on the specific, uncomfortable truth that these operations worked not by overcoming intelligence, but by finding the place where intelligence is not the thing doing the work. Deborah is 63 now. She lives in the flat on the other side of Nottingham, which she has filled, slowly, with things she chose deliberately, not things left over from a previous version of her life, but objects selected for the new one. Books, plants that require actual attention, a print of a coral reef she bought from a marine conservation charity, which hangs above her desk and has nothing to do with Emmanuel and everything to do with the fact that she decided, carefully and with full awareness of the decision, that his lies did not get to take her interests from her. She works part-time as a fraud recovery advocate for a charity that supports victims of online financial crime. The work is not paid at a level that reflects its difficulty or its value. She does not care about this particularly. She did not take the role for the income. She took it because she had found, in the months following her own recovery, that the thing most needed by people in the early stages of processing what had happened to them was contact with someone who understood from the inside, not theoretically, not professionally, but from the particular place of having been there. She has told her story, in controlled form, to journalists and documentary makers, and to a parliamentary committee examining the adequacy of the UK's response to romance fraud. She does not find the telling easy. She has become more accurate rather than easier. With repetition, she finds that she is better at the third telling than the first, better at the fifth than the third. Not because the story has become less painful, but because she has become more precise about which parts of the pain are hers and which parts were installed in her by someone else. She still reads about marine conservation. She has, since retiring from her retirement, completed an online course in environmental studies that she was initially dismissive of and then found herself absorbed in for 3 months. She walks along the canal near her flat most mornings. On a clear day, she sometimes thinks about the stretch of Tanzanian coastline that Emmanuel described in his early messages, the one north of the city, the one he visited when he needed to think. She does not know whether that place is real. She thinks it probably is. She thinks that somewhere inside the fiction there were probably fragments of something genuine, and that those fragments were exactly what made the fiction so effective. This thought no longer undoes her. It simply sits alongside everything else that is true about the situation, one piece of an account that is complex and honest and ongoing. There are things that people say about cases like this that are true, and things that are false, and the gap between them is exactly where the real damage lives. The false things. That the victims were naive, that they should have known, that this is a different category of experience from other betrayals because the relationship was conducted online and was therefore somehow less real or less valid or less deserving of the grief that follows. That the financial loss is the main injury, that the recovery, once the fiction is identified and dismantled, should be relatively straightforward. The true things. That these operations are designed by people with sophisticated knowledge of human psychology and applied with patience that most ordinary relationships cannot match. That the specific quality of attention they provide, the daily presence, the remembered details, the sense of being chosen by someone who had all the world to choose from, is not common in ordinary life and cannot be dismissed as a fantasy simply because it was manufactured. That what is lost is not just money and not just time, but a particular fragile sense of being seen in the way you most want to be seen, which is one of the rarest and most valuable things one person can offer another, and one of the cruelest things to have weaponized. D.C. Sandhu once said, in a press interview following the conclusion of her fraud investigation, that the question people kept asking her was how intelligent women could be taken in by something like this, and that she had come to feel that the question itself was the problem. The question assumed that intelligence was the relevant defense, and that its failure was therefore the interesting variable. But intelligence was never the relevant defense. Intelligence can evaluate evidence. It cannot evaluate its own hunger. It cannot see around the corner of its own loneliness. It is not built for that, and pretending it is has protected a great many fraudsters from scrutiny while doing precisely nothing to protect their victims. What would have protected Deborah Finch was not greater intelligence. She had more than sufficient intelligence. What might have protected her, and this is the part that is difficult to say without sounding like a criticism of the people who loved her, was someone in her life who had known her well enough and had been close enough to the daily texture of her experience to notice what was changing before it had been going on for 19 months. Someone who had access to her interior rather than her managed exterior. Someone she had let in before the crisis rather than during it. But Deborah, who had spent 40 years being the person that other people needed, and almost none of those years allowing herself to be the person who needed anything, had not given anyone access like that. She had not known how. She had not believed it was available to her. And when someone arrived from the other side of the world, through a screen, with the patience and specificity of someone who had studied her profile carefully before making first contact and offered access, she accepted it. Of course she accepted it. She'd been waiting for it for a very long time. Emmanuel Osei Boateng served his sentence in a Tanzanian facility. He will have completed it by the time this account reaches most of the people who will read it. He is not yet 30 years old. When investigators asked him, at the conclusion of formal questioning, whether he had anything he wanted to say about Deborah, he sat for a long time without speaking and then asked, through a translator, whether she was all right. The question has been commented on by almost everyone who has heard it. D.C. Sandhu said she did not know what to do with it. Dr. Marsh, when Deborah told her about it, said that its ambiguity was the most honest thing Emmanuel had probably said throughout the entire 19 months. Marcus Webb said it sounded like a question that should have arrived a great deal earlier. Deborah, when she was told about the question, did not respond immediately. She thought about it for several days. Eventually, she said that she had decided it was the right question and that she was glad he had asked it, even if the asking came far too late, even if it would never reach her with the weight of genuine accountability rather than the lighter weight of something she could only call belated conscience. She said, "Yes, she is all right. She is not what she was before. She is not the woman who sat at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening 18 months into her retirement and read a message about coral reefs from a young man in Dar es Salaam and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular sensation of being seen. That woman was real, and she was good, and she deserved better than what happened to her. But she is all right. She is still here. She still finds the ocean interesting." That is the ending this story has. It is not the ending she deserved. It is the one she was given and the one she has chosen, carefully and deliberately and with the same quiet authority she brought to everything else in her life, to live within. And she has decided this too was a decision, and it was hers alone that the loneliness which made her vulnerable was not a flaw. It was not something wrong with her, not evidence of a failure of character or judgment or professional competence. It was simply a human need that had gone unmet for a very long time. And there is no shame in having had that need, and there is no shame in having reached towards something that offered to meet it. And there is nothing in any of this story, not one chapter, not one moment that was her fault. The shame belongs to Emmanuel, who knew what he was doing and did it. It belongs to Solomon, who directed it and profited from it and walked away. It belongs to every element of the network that looked at a 58-year-old woman on a language exchange platform and saw a number with a target painted on it. It does not belong to Deborah. She has spent 3 years learning to believe that. On most days, she does. That is enough. That is, given everything, more than enough.